Salutations, everyone! So, as some of you may have been aware, I've been on vacation for the last 2 or 3 weeks, which sadly meant that I was not able to release my usual styled videos for some time now, despite me always trying to stick to 2 uploads every month. However, I have decided in order to compensate for the lack of content, I would make a response video, since these take far less time to make than your standard Lavader video where I explore certain topics. This idea came to mind after a viewer in the comment section on my video about corporatism brought to my attention a video on Kaiser Wilhelm II by the YouTuber JustTheFacts, labeling him as the worst Kaiser. And this viewer suggested that I should maybe organize a response video, and a few of my other viewers seemed to agree with it. So, here you are, boys. Your wish has finally come true. Now, I have watched several other videos from JustTheFacts in the past, and both of us seem to agree on many political topics, since we are both right-wing monarchists. But our differences start to show when it comes to certain historical figures as well as nations. So I just told myself, well, challenge accepted, and wanted to make a response video since I myself am an admirer of Wilhelm II. In his video about the Kaiser, JustTheFacts only presents his foreign policy decisions, and doesn't say a word about his decisions when it comes to managing the German nation from the inside. But for the sake of this video, I will also only focus on his foreign policy and not go off topic to talk about the internal affairs, unless they are in some way related to one another. JustTheFacts has 3 main arguments against the Kaiser, as you will bear witness: the League of Three Emperors, the Boer War, and the German-British naval arms race. So, I will be presenting my counter-arguments to his 3 points, while making additional comments on other things he says in the video along the way. With that out of the way, take it away, my man.
We'll go over how Willy ruined Germany's diplomacy, we'll go over how he ruined the country, and then we'll finally show how he ruined Western civilization as a whole. If you like this video and the idea of dabbing on the Kaiser kitties, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell button for notifications. Willy II came out in 1888 and Germany was in a relatively good spot. Bismarck, the Giga Chad of his time, has just finished uniting Germany through iron and blood, and he's made a good number of friends as well. Germany, Austria, and Russia form the League of Three Empires, united around the idea that democracy is pretty cringe, bro, and they lend troops to help put down uprisings in each other's nations.
Now, I'll go over the League of Three Emperors in a moment, but I would first like to point out that the alliance wasn't about crushing the libtards and democracy is cringe. The Russian Empire was the only nation in the alliance that had an autocratic government. Austria-Hungary and the German Empire were constitutional monarchies, meaning that they were democratic and had elections. The German Empire had the Reichstag, consisting of 397 seats chosen by a wider electorate than anywhere else in Europe. That doesn't sound very democracy is cringe bro to me. As JustTheFacts stated, the alliance was meant to help each other in their rebellions and keep the balance of power, nothing else.
Italy has treaties of friendship with Germany, and Britain has not yet Brentered colonial affairs, so they really don't care what's going on the continent. Germany is allied with all the important continental powers except France, and that basically makes them untouchable until the Willy forces its way in. Now at the beginning, Willy has some good goals, and we can actually rate his ambition at an A+. Willy wills that Germany should leverage its security, population, and economy on the continent to become a global power like Britain. They should secure control over key resources like rubber, and access to Chinese trade before the British blend India on it, and make his government all the more prestigious through access to an empire. This was a good idea. If you have all that security in Europe, you might as well direct resources to becoming more powerful abroad. Empires are generally very good things for the countries holding them, and so just like Xi Jinping today, Willy waggled out and began his quest to become a world power. pretty much immediately, he screwed up. Germany's alliance with Russia had to be renewed every 5 years. The Russians came expecting him to renew it due to their common interests in Europe, such as destroying the libtards, and he just didn't. The leader of Germany had an alliance with Russia, and he gave it up for nothing. Some people say he wanted to strengthen his ties with the Austrians, but if Bismarck managed to keep those two together for years, he should have been able to as well, especially considering that the Russians had been in a war with the French, the natural enemies of Germany, and the alliance should have been easy.
Alright, let's see. Why exactly did the League of Three Emperors fail? Well, JustTheFacts said that Bismarck managed to keep them together, but even Bismarck failed at that one point in time. The alliance was already showing cracks before Wilhelm even ascended on the throne, and the reason for that is quite simple: the Balkans. To put it simply, Austria-Hungary and Russia didn't exactly like each other very much, because both nations wanted to expand their influence in the Balkan region, and after Russia won a war against the Ottomans in 1878, the German Empire refused to grant Russia's idea of a Greater Bulgaria, which would give Russia access to the Mediterranean. The Russians felt cheated at the Berlin Congress, and the alliance broke up. Yes, not even Giga Chad Bismarck could stop the League from breaking up the first time. But it was restored once again in 1881, and this time it lasted until 1887. Can you guess what led to its collapse a second time? Yep, it was the Balkans again, and Bulgaria. Long story short, Bulgaria and Serbia fought a war, and Austria-Hungary supported Serbia in the conflict. This upset the Russians, so they promptly broke up the alliance. It's 1887, 1 year before Wilhelm came to power, and the alliance already broke up twice, and not even Bismarck could keep it together. As you can see, the League was not the most stable, and Wilhelm realized this. In the end, Germany had to pick a side here. It was either the Russians or the Austrians. Otherwise, the alliance would keep collapsing over and over again. However, you know what the ironic thing is? Wilhelm actually tried to maintain the alliance with Russia. Russia was the very first state he paid a visit to after coming to power, and reassured Tsar Alexander III that he hoped to keep the friendship between the two nations. However, it was Alexander who wanted to have nothing to do with Wilhelm, and he even described him as, quote, a badly brought up boy. So, in conclusion, the League of Three Emperors was a flawed concept from the very start, even before Wilhelm came to power, and even after he ascended the throne, he was eager to maintain good relations. But it was Tsar Alexander who dismissed him and saw him negatively. So in the end, Wilhelm had to pick a side here. If he chose the Russians, Austria would have then likely turned to France and Britain, and the balance of power would have still been destroyed. It was a lose-lose situation basically. Either you keep one or you don't get either. And so, Wilhelm just chose a side.
But Willie wasn't done wiggling yet. Now he needed to become an actual overseas power, and in order to do that, he needed to come to terms with Britain. There were many ways he could have done this. He could have sat down with them and partitioned Africa and other places. He could have agreed on arms limitation treaties. Or Willie could just weave around all these ideas, ignore diplomacy altogether, and build a big navy designed to intimidate the Brits into submission. He chose the last option, and it didn't work. The Limeys increased the size of their own navy, and even though Willie was able to pick up some colonies here and there, he never got recognition by the British as being legitimate, which was something he always wanted. Right now, tensions are higher, Britain is starting to wake up, but they're not outright hostile towards Germany just yet.
The infamous German-British naval arms race. I am not even gonna sugarcoat it and get straight to the point. The point of the German naval buildup was not in any way meant to intimidate Britain and create a rivalry. In fact, the naval buildup was not even about Britain at all. But you may ask yourself, why did the German Empire start to expand their navy like that? The answer is simple: economy, and to expand the German markets. Shortly after his accession, Wilhelm gave a 2-hour lecture to the Reichstag on the necessity of improving the navy, explaining that if the empire were to thrive, new outlets for exports were acquired, along with an effective merchant fleet, which in turn would require the protection of a powerful naval force. Due to Germany's geographic position, her access to major oceans was limited. To reach the Atlantic, it was necessary either to take a long route around the Shetland Islands or to pass through the English Channel, which could, at any time, be blocked by the French or British navies. So it was vital for Germany to have a fleet powerful enough to protect her trading ships in the event of an international dispute. Wilhelm repeatedly stated that the Navy's sole purpose was to protect Germany's trading interests and not meant to create a naval arms race with Britain and rival them on the sea. That was never his intention. Not only that, but numerous British naval officers knew that the buildup was never about them. Sir Edward Reed, a British naval architect, wrote, quote, "His motive in striving for sea power is quite simply this, that the German Empire has too many great and distantly located interests to enable it to retain its leading position without a reasonable expansion of its maritime forces. For the protection of its rapidly expanding commerce beyond the seas, the Empire requires a strong navy." End quote. So, did Wilhelm's plan of expanding the navy and trade routes work? Oh boy, did it. After the first and second naval bills were passed, German trade with Canada and the United States was rapidly increasing and the German economy was booming. German trade in the Americas became so successful that a British consul in Brazil stated that the Germans had economically conquered South America, and at this point, the British felt threatened by the Germans, not militarily, but economically. They felt so threatened to the point that they had to label any import from Germany with "Made in Germany" in hopes that the locals would boycott it. An American diplomat based in Berlin one time gave an interview to the Houston Chronicle in which he states, quote, "Germany is today the most efficient nation economically on the globe. The German policy is one of peaceful development of domestic and foreign trade. Germany does not seek offense, nor seek occasion to give offense. When the day comes that Germany passes Great Britain in the exportation of manufactured products, British resentment will perhaps result in an armed conflict between these two great nations." End quote. The truth of the matter is, Britain was so paranoid about the German success that they, in response, started rapidly expanding their navy as well, something the Germans quickly took note of, and after Britain developed their dreadnoughts, the Germans did as well, which just further escalated the conflict, and it was Britain's fault, not the Germans. In the end, the British made this whole thing about them, and they consistently demonized the Kaiser in the newspapers about his evil intentions to match with Britain. In conclusion, Wilhelm started out developing the navy not because he wanted to rival Britain, but because he wanted to expand the German trade across the globe. And when the German Empire started making enormous profits off of the new trade routes, the British felt economically threatened that Germany was going to surpass them. So in the end, they made the whole thing about them, saying how the Germans wanted to rival Britain from the start with their navy, when, in reality, they were just doing it in order to economically advance their nation. Can you really blame someone for for wanting to protect German trade interests by expanding the navy. And even if the expansion of the navy had more to do with military might to match with Britain, what exactly is wrong with that as well?
But unfortunately for all of us, per usual, Willie isn't done with the world yet. If Britain was skeptical before, Willie's next moves made them outright hostile towards Germany. Willie's policy of expanding colonially and building a huge navy to compete with the Brits has always been done in an effort to make the Brits their ally, the tsundere that he was. He wouldn't even need a big navy to compete with the Brits if they were his allies. But if this stupidity wasn't enough, he had to waggle his willy in South Africa. The Boers are revolting, per usual, and they beat back the Brits in a couple battles. Willie sends them a telegram congratulating them on their great victory that they accomplished without even appealing to friendly foreign powers such as himself. Why would you do this? He wants an alliance with the Brits. The Boers aren't worth anything in terms of an alliance compared to the biggest empire in the world, and the ill will that they got from it definitively ends any possibility of an alliance. He has now cast himself as the enemy of British interests in Africa and around the world, and all for nothing.
Wilhelm II never even wrote the telegraph that was sent to the Boers. The person who did write it was the Chancellor, Prince Hohenlohe. All Wilhelm did was sign the telegraph, and even when he did sign it, he wasn't particularly eager, and in the beginning, outright refused to sign it because, as Just the Fact stated, it would harm his relations with Britain. However, the issue was that the German public was overwhelmingly in support of the Boers, and Wilhelm, not signing the telegraph, had a possibility of turning the public against him, since there was already controversy surrounding whether he served British or German interests. This is something the Chancellor himself was worried about. Quote, "Otherwise, there was a danger that the excited attitude of the German people, deeply outraged in its sense of justice and also in its sympathy for the Boers, might cause it to break down the barriers and turn against the Kaiser personally." End quote. As I stated, Wilhelm was very hesitant to sign the telegraph, but after pressure from the Chancellor and the Reichstag, he saw no other choice and had to give in. And right after the telegraph was sent, surprise, surprise, the British press was filled with anti-German sentiment. The attacks against him were so vitriolic that even several British journalists were aghast. Wilhelm never even wrote the telegraph, nor was he so trigger-happy to congratulate them as Just the Facts portrayed. He was very much against signing the telegraph, and only conceded after pressure from his government. But even after all the backlash he received by the British press and public, after Queen Victoria passed away, Wilhelm expressed so much sorrow for her death that it actually partially restored his image in the British public after the whole Boers affair. Overall, his relationship with the British Empire during the reign of Queen Victoria was still pretty stable, but it wasn't the Boers War that put a nail in the coffin for German-British relations, and you will see in a second what did, and it actually came from the British.
So, the Brits join up with the Russians and the Frenchies, and let's put this in perspective as well. The Brits have been at war with the French on and off for nearly 1,000 years at this point. They're competing with them in Asia and Africa, and the Russians are even bigger enemies of the Brits. They fought in Crimea, and they're fighting each other in what's called the Great Game in Central Asia, because the Brits were actually worried the Russians could try to invade India through that area. And of course, the Brits were liberals with a democracy, while the Russians, as stated, were an absolute monarchy who liked destroying the libtards. So if you consider the Entente, all three of these countries are natural enemies. They should not be working together considering how many of their interests and ideologies are in opposition. But one man managed to upend all that, the Wallacious Willie himself.
Yes, believe it or not, it is not too uncommon for nations that don't like each other to suddenly start working together if their geopolitical interests aligned. You had the Bulgarians and Turks working together in the First World War, despite the wounds of the Balkan War still being very fresh. And the same goes for the Germans and the Austrians. So no, it is not too absurd to think that the Russians, British and French would suddenly start working together like that. Folks, Meet King Edward VII. This is the man who nailed the final nail in the coffin of German-British relations. Edward, even before he was king, had a personal grudge against Wilhelm. And it was this personal grudge against the Kaiser that steered the British Empire into an anti-German foreign policy. Wilhelm, multiple times during his reign, extended an olive branch to the British, and every single time, this fine specimen of a man turned it down. Wilhelm proposed for the Baghdad-Berlin Railway to be a joint British-German effort, and the king just didn't. At one point, he even tried to persuade the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Franz Joseph, to join the Entente against Germany, and probably worst of all, during the Moroccan crisis, he told the French Prime Minister that the British Empire was ready for an invasion of Germany if it escalates. Not only does this man turn down any good offers from Germany, but he was openly being hostile to them just because he had a grudge against Wilhelm. So, let's consider this for a moment. Edward coming to power would have resulted in the creation of the Entente Cordiale in any case, because Edward hated Wilhelm personally. And if Wilhelm chose the Russians over the Austrians, Edward would have easily been able to sway the Austrians over to his side. And the same happened with the Russians in our time. Can this really be something Wilhelm should take the blame for? He tried to work for peace with England, but Edward wasn't having any of it, and the Russian affair I have already explained numerous times. This wasn't the result of Wilhelm having some schizophrenic visions of world domination and the Entente wanting to curb his lust for power.
We all know what happens next. World War I, Soviet Union, millions of Germans behind foreign borders, Mustache Man, Iron Curtain, Europe is now irrelevant. We might say that Willy ruined Germany by bringing the full wrath of the Entente upon it and opening the path for the funny Mustache Man. It would be far more accurate to say he ruined Western civilization as a whole. In 1914, Europe plus America, which was basically a European country at this point, ruled the world. Africa was ruled directly, as was most of Asia. China and Latin America were ruled through capitalist spheres of influence and investments. Free trade and prosperity was the rule for all the peoples of Europe. If it hadn't been for the pointless war of Willy's design, that peace could have lasted a very long time, and the West could still rule the world today. You might think that's a bad thing if you're, say, Indian, and maybe if you're Indian, you're now Willy's biggest fan. But you cannot deny that Willy took Western civilization from its highest point ever in terms of power, prosperity, and prestige, and brought it back down to where it now has to compete with other civilizations with their own ideas of how the world should be run.
Really? Just wow. Now explain to me exactly what Wilhelm did wrong here. He chose the Austrians over the Russians, which in my opinion was a good decision because the League of Three Emperors was a failed project in many ways. He expanded the German navy to expand trade, which made the Brits salty and jealous of their success, something which even the British minister confirmed. And to top it all off, despite everything, Wilhelm did his best to maintain good relations with all nations across Europe. Yes, even France. At one point he even laid a wreath for fallen French soldiers during the Franco-Prussian War. Wilhelm did his best to maintain peace in Europe, which is exactly why he was known as the Peace Kaiser before the First World War. And even in 1914, he tried his best to de-escalate the conflict, but in the end, war did indeed break out. And it was not because of Wilhelm. The topic of who started the First World War is a topic I am not going to get into now, since this is a topic for a different video. How can you blame Wilhelm for everything that led up to the First World War? What about King Edward VII, who kept escalating the conflict with Germany and refused to cooperate with them? What about Serbia, not doing anything about the Black Hand, which in turn assassinated Franz Ferdinand and still being stubborn after the assassination took place? What about Sazonov, who ignored Tsar Nicholas's request for demobilization, which could have quite literally prevented the entire conflict? Take all of this into consideration, and somehow the one guy who worked desperately to ensure peace in Europe is taking the blame for it. Not only for the First World War, but the fall of Western civilization as a whole. Now that is just a step too far. I have not heard something so absurd in a long while. It is really sad to see just how vilified and demonized the Kaiser was, despite all his efforts to keep the peace in Europe. The Entente went hard, portraying him as a cruel tyrant and mentally unstable, when he never actually was that. Now, despite everything I said in this video, I do admit that Wilhelm was not a perfect ruler, and he did have his own fair share of flaws for sure, but he is far from being this mentally deranged individual who brought Germany to ruin as he is always portrayed, and as well how Just the Facts is portraying him in this video.